Welcome to the Safety Net. I'm your host, Stephen Bressler. It seems as though every other day there's a tragic story in the news about domestic abuse. Today's story is about a college student, a young woman, who allegedly psychologically abused her boyfriend and urged him to kill himself, which sadly he did. Yesterday, I attended a well-attended workshop on domestic abuse led by Julie Yudovin, who was a guest on the Safety Net a few weeks ago. And as much as I know about domestic abuse, I realize there is so much more to be learned about this social problem. So I'm pleased today to welcome Jessica Teperow, Director of Prevention Programs at REACH, Beyond Domestic Violence, an organization that serves thousands of persons each year. Jessica, welcome to the Safety Net. Please tell our viewers first, what is REACH?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to the show. So REACH is a domestic violence program. We're an organization based in Waltham. We will be celebrating 40 years next year, so we've been around for a long time. And we provide various services to the community. So we were initially started by a group of volunteers who recognized that domestic violence was an issue that far too often is shrouded in secrecy and shame and misunderstood. And so they really started the organization with this goal of doing exactly what we're doing right now, sitting down around someone's kitchen table or in their living room and having a conversation, helping to educate people about domestic violence. At the time, especially, the domestic violence movement was really in its infancy, and I think a lot of people who understood that it existed sort of took a stance of, oh, that's a terrible problem somewhere else. And so they really wanted to raise awareness that domestic violence happens in all communities, including suburban and affluent communities. What they realized very quickly is that if you start conversations about intimate partner violence, an issue that unfortunately has long been considered taboo, but as we both know is incredibly prevalent, people will come forward looking for safety, looking for support. And so while they initially started the organization with this goal of education and awareness raising, they quickly realized they needed to pivot and start with providing support and listening and safety. So they started with a hotline, and back then, the way that it was run all by volunteers. Our very first grant was to buy an answering machine, which when I go out and tell that to young people, they have no idea what I'm talking about. They wanted to ensure that even though at that time they couldn't staff it 24/7, people knew that if they left a message that they would get a call back. Our organization has grown tremendously since our humble beginnings. We now continue to have a 24-hour hotline, which is open every day, every minute of the year. And again, that's for both survivors of domestic violence, but also for friends and family or others that are concerned about someone and need some support, need some information, need some options that they can offer. We do have a shelter, which is a confidential location that can hold up to 8 families at a time. We have a community program that works with survivors who are not in shelter but living in the 27 cities and towns that we serve in the Metro West area. And they serve the highest volume of survivors, given that our shelter can only house 8 families at a time. People often immediately think of shelter when they think of domestic violence, but many people are living in our communities who've either experienced domestic violence in the past or are still experiencing it. And they need support, they need advocacy, they need someone to help them navigate the legal system or other systems to help them. And so our advocates do a whole lot to support people and meet them where they're at and go on that journey with them. One of the things I think is really incredible about REACH is that there's not a time limit to that work. And so we are constantly getting calls of referrals and survivors looking for support. And we also have survivors we've worked with for over a decade. And so we know that domestic violence is not a one-time incident and it doesn't have a one-time effect. And so we also know that it ripples out and affects the community. So my team is the prevention team. There's 4 of us, and we try to address this issue in various ways. We have a youth education specialist who works in the middle schools and the high schools. We also do a lot of work on college campuses. We have a community engagement specialist who partners with communities to build their capacity to recognize, respond to, and prevent domestic violence. We have a volunteer program coordinator so when we go out into the community and people decide, you know what, I want to be involved in this, but I don't know how, we have an amazing volunteer program coordinator who can help to match them to various ways in which they can support the organization. And then my role, in addition to supporting my amazing team, is really getting to train professionals who interface with survivors of domestic violence. a lot of times survivors, may not know about organizations like ours or may not be interested in working with a domestic violence organization, but they are walking into their hair salon or their doctor's office or their workplace. And if we can arm all of those individuals and institutions and businesses with this vital information, the hope is that those survivors can still gain access to that, can still gain access to support and options and resources. And so we try to be in a lot of different places and spaces to ensure that wherever a survivor goes, they're met with that support and they're met with safety.
Let's jump to the workplace. I mean, one thing you hear about with perpetrators is that they try to isolate the victim. Okay, and the workplace might be the only place where she, and I'm assuming that most victims are women, where she can be away from her abuser. So. Let's talk about that.
Sure.
How does it impact the workplace, and what can a workplace do? What should people? If the victim isn't talking about what she's experiencing? What should her coworkers be looking for?
Absolutely.
Physically, or hearing her talking emotionally, or whatever.
Sure. So a couple things I want to mention, and then to fully address the question about workplace issues. The first is, I think we hear the most about perpetrators of abuse being male and victims of abuse being female. But as you mentioned, even in the example that you gave at the beginning of the show, people can be abusive regardless of their gender identity or regardless of their sex, regardless of their sexual orientation. And so we actually see domestic violence existing in various relationships and affecting people of all identities. And part of why that's important is that if somebody does identify, for instance, as male and their abuser is female, or if they are LGBT, or if they identify as trans, there can be additional barriers to talking about domestic violence. An assumption that nobody will believe me because how could I as a male be abused? And as you showed in the example you started the show with, that very much can happen. And I think part of why it's hard for people to understand that is that we often think of domestic violence as being only physical. And so we think of physical dominance. And since we often assume that men are more physically dominant than women, our assumption is that they will always be the abusers and women will always be the victims. And we have other gender stereotypes. I hear a lot when I work with female survivors whose abusers are female identified, this idea that no one will believe me because people don't think that women can be abusive to other women. And so I think there's a lot of barriers to talking about these issues, and that can be true, especially when we think about the intersection of someone's identity. So to us, when we think about domestic violence, we really think about power and control. We think of one person, an abuser, using patterns of behaviors to gain and maintain power and control over their partner. Isolation is often a key factor in that. So if someone doesn't have connection to their family and friends, if they've become isolated from people in their lives, then the abuser gains more and more control. The way I like to describe it sometimes is that in a healthy relationship, both people's worlds grow bigger. So when you get into a new relationship and it's a healthy relationship, you each support one another in your interests and your career. You get to know their friends and their family. They get to know yours, and your world expands. In an unhealthy and abusive relationship, one person's world continues to grow, the abusers. The other person's world, the survivors, continues to shrink and shrink and shrink. And so that isolation can leave a lot of people feeling like they don't have an option. They could not leave that relationship. They could not tell anybody because who would I tell? My friends and family hate my partner, or my partner has isolated me so much that nobody calls me anymore. And so who would I even start with, right? Where would I go? Last year, I went to an event sponsored by Employers Against Domestic Violence, which is a wonderful organization here in Massachusetts. And they had a survivor share her story. And that was one of the things she talked about, that she had become so isolated that her workplace really was the only place where she really felt safe, where she felt like she had people she could talk to who knew her, not just about her relationship, but just in general, to be able to feel connection. Each one of us needs that social connectedness to be able to thrive in our lives. Unfortunately for her, when she did finally come forward to her workplace, they were shocked and saddened to hear what happened, and I think really felt ill-equipped to know what to say or what to do, which is not uncommon. It can be overwhelming and scary for any of us. And so their solution was to say, you know what, this is terrible. We're so sorry you're going through this. Why don't you take a couple weeks off? And unfortunately, that time off was when the violence really escalated, because her workplace was her safety, right? That was her safety net.
Right.
That's where she was able to go and be away. And so I think very well intentioned, but not necessarily the best solution. So in terms of being able to sort of counteract that isolation, I think first and foremost, we don't necessarily want coworkers or employers to feel like they have to be detectives. We do want people to be noticing if someone's behavior is changing, or if someone is becoming more isolated, or other subtle signs that might be, indicative of anything going on in someone's life, whether it's caring for an elder parent who's not doing well or an abusive relationship. But with abuse in particular, I think workplaces have an opportunity to do some universal education. So ensuring that people know that, a lot of workplaces right now are really focused on the employee's well-being. And we see that with big companies trying to attract employees by, having healthy food available, or a gym, or, various benefits. And that often gets people excited about, I could work out during my workday, or there's yoga, or there's all these wonderful things. This is integral to someone's well-being if they are safe in their relationships. And so that can be sort of cushioned in those efforts to support employees' well-being, to talk about relationship health, and not just the negative side of it, but also what does relationship health mean, and what does that look like? If people assume that someone will always come forward, like you said, there's so many reasons, including isolation, that someone may not feel like, oh, my employer is the person I should go to. There can be a lot of shame, and even just a feeling of what could they really do for me. Here in Massachusetts in 2014, we passed a bill called Chapter 260, an act relative to domestic violence, which includes protections for employees. So it requires that companies with 50 or more employees offer up to 15 days of domestic violence employment leave. It's up to the employer, how much time that is, and whether that's paid or unpaid, and what the policy around that is. But it's important that we don't just bury that information in a handbook, that if we want people to know that their safety is important to us, that we go out of our way to share that information, that we go out of our way to really talk about what domestic violence is, and that there are resources available. There's a wonderful online resources called Workplaces Respond that has a lot of information, including sample policies that workplaces can adopt. And they recommend that you have a team who is trained to be able to respond to issues of domestic violence.
Would this be through a human resources department, or?
It often should include human resources for sure, but even things like facilities or IT, because if someone does come forward and are asking for accommodations to help to increase their safety at work, we talk a lot about workplace violence right now. There's an enormous intersection with domestic violence. A lot of the cases that we've heard, tragic cases of workplace violence, are often an abuser stalking their partner at their workplace. Yeah. And so if we're thinking about safety, a lot of times that has to do with technological safety and physical safety of the building. So for instance, last year I worked with a survivor who did feel like their workplace was a place where they could talk to their employer about what they were experiencing. And so they worked with facilities to ensure that the entrances now were locked and you had to key in to get into the building. Little, subtle changes like that can make a tremendous difference. The other employees had no idea why that was happening and were complaining about the inconvenience of having to remember their key card. But I think that's becoming more and more common practice in a lot of places and spaces. Schools now, places of worship, many of them are adopting more safety policies. And again, we often think of that as community violence, but we also have to be thinking about that for intimate partner violence as well.
Me Too is a big issue right now. What about sexual harassment in the workplace?
Yeah. So a lot of times businesses and then institutions of higher learning will have sort of an umbrella policy referred to as a sexual misconduct policy, and it will include specific information about domestic violence, stalking, and sexual violence, including sexual harassment. And I think what really unifies all of those issues is that they really come down to power and control. So in the workplace, there is often both an implicit and explicit understanding of who has power and who does not. And so, really being mindful of the types of relationships that people develop in a workplace and whether or not somebody feels like they have the ability to say no or not. So if somebody is flirting with me and that person I feel has power over my livelihood, over my job, over my career, then my ability to really determine, whether this is something I want or not is influenced by that. And so I think it's important for people to understand that, the Me Too movement really tried to shine a light on those power dynamics. And I think what's interesting is that sexual harassment in the workplace has been an issue for a very long time. And I think for many of us, watching this movement sort of explode and the conversations that are happening now, for people who have experienced sexual harassment in the past, for many of them, they were sort of just taught, just deal with it. That's just the way it is. And the Me Too movement was a moment of saying, it should not be that way and it will not be that way anymore. And so I think people have had a lot of different reactions to that, both, excitement about the changes that are happening, as well as sadness that those changes have to be made at all. But I think that's important for people to consider in terms of what does the workplace environment feel like? I think for all of us, we believe that if there was a very obvious sign of violence in our workplace, that we would intervene, right? If we saw someone hit someone else in the workplace, we would know that is wrong, that is something that I should interrupt. But those overt forms of violence happen because of all the covert and subtle things that say you can get away with that. So that includes things like jokes. That includes, comments that people make, especially victim-blaming comments. When there's a big story in the news and you hear people, casually talking about it in the lunchroom and the comments they're making, all of those things send messages to survivors of whether or not this is a place where people will support me or not. But it also sends messages to people who perpetrate sexual harassment, sexual violence, domestic violence of, oh, people seem to think this is okay, I can get away with this. So when we talk about, bystander intervention or accountability, I think we really have to talk about those more subtle moments. We think of it as a pyramid, right? In order for the most egregious forms of violence to exist, in order for, gun violence, rape, sexual violence, homicide, in order for that to happen, it has to be built on a solid foundation of a culture that says, you can do that. You can, have power over someone else in these ways. And so it's more that I think joking especially is where people feel the most difficult, the strongest barrier to intervention, because there's a feeling of, am I taking things too seriously? Am I overreacting? But it's a ripple effect. If we don't call out those behaviors, it creates an environment in which people do not feel safe.
Okay, so how do you call out those behaviors?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think, for instance, of Joe Biden being criticized for putting his hands on a woman. George W. Bush was at a conference with Angela Merkel of Germany, and he put his hands on her back, and she was upset about that. But I'm sure that it happens in the workplace. And is any of this generational? Do people of a certain age do this more often than younger people who are more woke, let's say?
I think, again, that generational piece, I think, is important in thinking about what messages have been given to us for so long. They feel like part of us. They feel like absolute fact about, the ways in which we interact, or the things that's okay for me to do or not okay for me to do. And so, I think that for folks that, have been in the workforce for a long time and have seen certain behaviors always be considered appropriate and okay, oh, that's just an affectionate person, or they don't mean it in that way, or they're just joking, that's just how they are. All of those things are giving people permission. And I think what's important about that is thinking about intention, but also impact. So I may, do something or say something that I have the best of intention, and it has a negative impact on the other person. And I may get defensive about, well, that wasn't my intention, but that doesn't mean that that wasn't the impact that they experienced. And so I do think it's important for us to be considering that in terms of boundaries in all spaces, whether it's, boundaries in terms of time, of, getting emails and phone calls from your boss at a certain time of night when you feel like the workday should be done, to physical boundaries around physical touch. And so I think each one of us comes to our workplace with our own experiences around physical boundaries, and some of us may be very affectionate, may come from a family system where, to show someone you're proud of them, you pat them on the back or those sorts of things, but we don't know what our colleagues' experiences of that is, and we also don't know how people perceive our experience or our power, really. And so for me to feel like, I'm proud of my employee, I can pat them on the back or give them a big hug, I have a different level of power, right? Because they report to me. And so their ability to say no thank you might be really hard for them because they're afraid of offending their boss. And so, in our field, a lot of what we do is ask permission, right? And the worst thing is someone says no but they say thank you for asking. Actually, I'm not comfortable with a hug. And I think that people who have been accustomed to assuming feel like, but I shouldn't have to ask that. But again, you might think that you have the best of intention, but you don't know the kind of impact that can have on someone else. In order for us to have healthy relationships, and I mean relationships of all kinds, not just dating relationships, working relationships, professional relationships, friendships, family, it is respecting one another's boundaries. And sometimes we know what those boundaries are, and sometimes we don't. And so I think a lot of it is just practicing modeling healthy boundaries and also checking in about what someone else's boundaries are.
So what's a good resource if a company wants to put this into an employee manual, for instance? Does Reach have something for it?
Yeah. We do a lot of training. I mentioned some online resources if what they really want is, a model policy. The Workplaces Respond, which is in partnership with Futures Without Violence, has some great online resources. But as I mentioned before, if you build a policy, be ready to carry that policy out. So if you say that, the company will respond in a certain way, does the person who is supposed to have that response know that, and have they been trained? So, especially after 2014, when that law was changed, we had a lot of requests from human resources departments and employers to come out and do a training for them so that they weren't just creating a policy that was just a written policy, but a policy that was a living, breathing thing. And so that included ways that they were going to educate their employees. We've done lunch and learns. We've done, posters and brochures around the office. It can be done in subtle ways and very explicit ways. You can do things like, get your employees involved in a volunteer opportunity. And so there's an action, but there's also information, so it can be more subtle ways that they connect people with resources. But we do a lot of training so that people know they have the foundation to build that policy off of and really feel like they're informed, and therefore they can inform their employees about that.
So when you do these trainings, you have handouts that have all links to all of these resources.
Exactly. Yeah, we actually put together, both written but then also online, because we know people have different opinions about what's most accessible, and really trying to tailor it to that workplace. Each workplace has its own individual culture, and the people who work there know best about what the challenges might be of enacting a policy, as well as what the strengths might be. We've worked with some companies where they felt like people really don't see HR as their main resource. This is the folks that most people go to if they're struggling with something in their lives. So those are the people that we want to train, and we want to bring HR into that to help decrease that barrier and help people recognize that this is a resource for them. So it's different for each place, and so we really try to tailor it to the individual needs of that company.
Human resources certainly is a place to go, but what about the CEO, CEO's office? Well, yeah, I mean, there's a thought also, because sometimes it's the CEO who might be an abuser, or might be setting the stage, or who's the one who's doing the touchy-feely, using inappropriate language, et cetera, with employees.
Yeah.
Where can one go if the abuse is coming from someone that high up? Where can you go outside of your company?
Yeah.
I mean, if you were experiencing discrimination, you could go to the MCAD or the EEOC. Is there a place to go?
This is considered gender discrimination. It's often cushioned under that, and so there are legal resources, but there's I think again a lot of it is the emotional support that people need as well, and it's very intimidating to call out someone in a position of power. My hope is that people in leadership positions are recognizing more and more that they need to invest in this issue, even just from a cost perspective. It's estimated that the cost in terms of, lost productivity, et cetera, to businesses in the United States is between $4 and $5 billion a year. So even just from a financial perspective, but again, I think a lot of companies are trying to distinguish themselves as we care about our employees' well-being. This is a humongous component of that. And so if you're going to invest in a rock climbing wall, you should also invest in bringing in domestic violence education so that if somebody needs support or they need safety and the workplaces where they turn to for help, you know how to provide that. And even again, I think a lot of workplaces are more and more aware of the threat of workplace violence. Again, there's such a strong connection to that. And so I think sometimes we silo things out and just try to focus on one thing, but people's lives are not siloed, they're interconnected. And so the workplace for many of us, it's where we find social connectedness, a sense of mastery, stability, safety. And so, workplaces should be considering that in terms of the role that they can play. I think it's easy to go to the worst case scenario, and I think sometimes I try to flip that and think about what an important role workplaces can play. We hear the horrible stories of the CEOs or the executives who are abusing their power, and we know that that's possible because power is what feeds domestic violence. And I want to believe that there are people in leadership positions who are ready to really take this issue on, and they have a tremendous ability, but also, I believe, responsibility to do so.
As I said at the beginning of the show, there is so much to learn learn about this. Yep. What have we not covered yet? We really haven't gone into the different types of domestic violence, of domestic abuse. We've only got a few minutes. There's physical abuse. So you see someone coming into the office with a black eye or a broken arm, and more than once, say. There's emotional abuse, which may communicate to coworkers. One of the things that gets to me is when someone is experiencing this type of abuse and someone says, well, why don't you just leave, and don't understand you can't just leave. Right. I know of a situation where the husband has full financial control. If the wife were to leave, no financial history, no credit history, doesn't have the wherewithal, doesn't have family, doesn't have the wherewithal to relocate, et cetera. What do you do? Can you go to reach for that?
Yeah, so we work with people regardless of whether or not they want to leave the relationship. So some of the people we work with are going to stay in that relationship and never leave, and they still deserve emotional support and safety planning. Some people are considering leaving, and we know that when somebody attempts to leave, that is the most dangerous time for them. Again, if we really understand domestic violence as being about control, then when an abuser feels like they are losing that control is when they escalate their behavior. Many of the tragedies we've had here in Massachusetts as well as around the world that we hear about on the news, you often have a line in that article or in that news story about the couple had just divorced, or were just about to divorce, or the victim in this case in a homicide had been talking about leaving or ending the relationship. And so just leaving isn't necessarily the answer, and even if someone is going to leave, there's a lot of safety planning that often needs to go along with that. And so that, again, if you create a workplace in which they feel comfortable talking about it, that's important for the workplace to know. Part of why this often happens in the workplace is that it's a place where the abuser can predict the survivor will be, and so they know if I show up there, they'll be there. So I think it's important to be aware of that. And so absolutely people who are not looking to leave the relationship, we are part of an amazing network here in Massachusetts of sexual and domestic violence organizations. And so if people are interested in finding out which resources is most local to them, Jane Doe, which is our state coalition of sexual and domestic violence organizations, has an ability on their website, if you go to janedoe.org, to go to get help and search by your zip code. So you can see all the resources that serve your community and decide which one sort of best meets your needs. The thing I would say lastly in terms of things that we might notice is that psychological abuse is really, I think, one that shows up, I think, in many ways in the workplace, both in terms of being harassed in the workplace and how that makes somebody feel, But also if someone that they love and care about and spend their time with is making them doubt themselves and doubt their sense of reality, that's going to show up in their work as well. If you start to notice somebody who seems to be losing confidence in their ability, checking in with that person to see what's going on.
Jessica, we are out of time. Really, thank you so much for being on this show. I'm sure we could do several shows. There is so much information to cover. Want to thank our viewers for watching. You can always see us on YouTube. Go to youtube.com and search for The Safety Net. The Safety Net is a project of the Brookline Domestic Violence Roundtable in cooperation with Brookline Interactive Group. See you next time.